Hi there, this is a video called Nailing Issues and Debates, which is about your paper 3 topic, Issues and Debates. What I'm going to do in this video is not go through what the issues and debates are. Instead, I'm going to focus on the specification and I'm going to unpick it in terms of highlighting some common errors that I see from students in the examination, and also just in general in terms of students that I've taught over the years. We're going to begin with gender and cultural bias. So we've got the specification there at the top. So gender and culture in psychology, universality and bias, gender bias including androcentrism and alpha and beta bias, cultural bias including ethnocentrism and cultural relativism. So that's the specification. Now here's some issues I think students face with issues and debates in the gender and cultural bias. The first one is what examples to use. So in the issues and debates essay, if it's coming up as a 16 mark or indeed shorter answer questions, you could be asked to refer to topics that you've studied. And even in a 16 marker, if you're not asked to refer to topics that you've studied, actually integrating topics into your answer is a great way to show knowledge of that debate. So the question is then, well, what examples do I use? So the big kind of error tends to be on the gender bias section when we look at alpha and beta bias. So for beta bias, there's some suggested examples for you to use here. So we've got Milgram, Ash, Zimbardo, fight or flight response. So just remember the beta bias in research is where differences between the genders are minimized. So for Milgram, Ash, Zimbardo and the fight or flight response, the reason that I picked those out is because they're all pieces of research that were based on what we call an androcentric sample. That's to say they were all males. Now, students are often quite good at outlining why these particular pieces of research are beta bias and drawing reference to the sample, but what they're not very good at doing is then exploring the consequences of this beta bias, because what you've got to show in this essay, or indeed any question on beta bias, is why beta bias in psychological research is an issue. Remember, this is called issues and debates. So let's take Milgram's research, for example. So the reason that it becomes an issue is in Milgram, Ash, Zimbardo, and any kind of androcentric or gynocentric piece of research, the conclusion that's reached is never that this is something that applies wholly to males. The conclusion that's reached, for example, from Milgram's research is that things like legitimate authority and the agentic state are important mediating factors in terms of obedience. The problem is that, well, does this apply to females? So for example, if I'm going to repeat Milgram's piece of research with females and I find something different, does that mean then that females become abnormal in some way? So the problem is with beta bias, and when we talk about beta bias, we often talk about it in relation to androcentric pieces of research, and this is simply because most pieces of research that were done, and these are pieces of research that we reference in psychology, are done using male samples simply because at that time these were the sample that was available when you're using undergraduate students that were mainly a population of males at this time. So we don't really know too much about females in terms of how they're going to react in this situation, and the issue is that if females react differently, do then we somehow see them as being abnormal. Now, with alpha bias, it's the same problem with students. They can describe alpha bias in theories. So the classic ones to look at perhaps are the work of Freud and Bowlby. Remember, alpha bias is assuming that there is some kind of difference. So with the Freud research, students often talk about the idea of his conceptualization of the psychosexual stages, in particular looking at the phallic stage of development and the idea that males will have to resolve this Oedipus complex. Now, why is that alpha bias? Well, it's alpha bias because Freud never considered what happened to females. We often talk about the Electra complex, but that wasn't an idea that Freud came up with. So again, what we've got is this idea that, well, males and females are different because males and females are going to resolve the phallic stage in different ways because they are different genders. Bowlby is very, very similar in the sense that, although he never explicitly stated this idea that the primary caregiver had to be the mother, it was very much orientated towards the idea that it was the mother that was the primary caregiver. Now, as we know, and we can link this into ethical implications later on, this has so many consequences because of the pressure then placed on the mother. This whole idea that the father can't be the primary caregiver, perhaps because he's not biologically equipped in some way to be this. The next thing I just want to talk about is cultural relativism. Cultural relativism is something that you're introduced to probably relatively early on. So for example, let's say when you're studying psychopathology in paper 1 and you talk about the definitions of abnormality and you perhaps criticise them on the basis that they're culturally relativist. So you've got used to the idea of cultural relativism being a bad thing, because the idea of it, if it only applies to one culture and not other cultures, then it's not a universal theory, which is something we'll talk about in the last bullet point. But actually, cultural relativism is a good thing, because in some ways we need to study a culture from within a culture. That's to say, we might want to use an emic approach to studying that culture. For example, if you look at Ainsworth's strange situation, Ainsworth's strange situation, as applied by Van Isendorn when they looked at the meta-analysis, they looked at the strange situation among a number of different cultures and obviously found some variations within cultures. The problem of Ainsworth's strange situation is it's this idea of an imposed ethic. That's to say, the ethnocentric ideas about Western attachment being what attachment should look like. So when we get variations, for example, in Germany, where we see more insecure avoidance, then we've got this question mark of, well, that means there's something wrong with the way the Germans are raising their children. But it doesn't, because if we took a more culturally relativistic approach and we actually understood the German child rearing process, we'd see that because they foster independence in children, they see that as a positive thing. So for us to label them as insecure avoidant and that to be a negative thing becomes an issue. So within cultural relativism in the issues and debates section, what I'd say is kind of be wary of saying that it's a negative thing, because it can actually be a positive thing because it allows us a more thorough understanding of culture. For universality, this is one of the bullet points that's often misunderstood. Universality is simply the idea that a theory can apply to all. That's to say, regardless of gender and regardless of culture. Now, this is something that I spoke about, which can often contend against the idea of cultural relativism, because a theory that's culturally relativist isn't going to be universal, but in the same sense, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's a bad thing. So when we talk about universality, we're almost linking into the ideographic and nomothetic approach. Remember, the nomothetic approach is about establishing general laws and principles, which is fine because that's one of the goals of science, but it doesn't mean that it's the only way to conduct research. Okay, the next bullet point is free will and determinism. So we've got the spec on the top there: free will and determinism, hard determinism and soft determinism, biological, environmental and psychic determinism, and the scientific emphasis on causal explanations. So let's just think about what this debate is about. Why is it a debate in psychology? Well, it's a debate because there are some theories that believe that our behaviour is determined by factors, and there are other theories believe that our behaviour aren't determined by factors. That's to say, we have free will. There is an element of choice. Now, we're introduced to two terms here: hard determinism and soft determinism. Now, this is really the spectrum in terms of determinism. So how much determinism am I going to allow into a theory? Am I going to say something is wholly determinismed, that's to say very hard determinism, or just more soft determinism, so having a gene and that may be giving you a predisposition for something but not necessarily mean that gene is going to be activated? Now, students struggle with linking examples to the type of determinism, and when I say types of determinism, I'm referring to biological, environmental and psychic determinism, not this spectrum of determinism. So for biological determinism, what we can talk about is the influence of genes. Now, in terms of linking into topics, there's a really nice link into psychopathology here. So in psychopathology, for example, you talk about the idea of the COMT and the SERT gene having some kind of malfunction in OCD. That's to say, there is a difference in the sense of the way that these genes are going to manifest themselves in an individual that has OCD and an individual that not has OCD. And the manifestation of these genes, the activation of these genes, is going to determine whether or not a person has OCD. That's a deterministic idea in the point of biology. For environmental determinism, we can stick with psychopathology again, and we can look at the two-process model. Remember, the two-process model is a behavioural explanation of how we acquire phobias through a process of classical conditioning and how those phobias are maintained through a process of operant conditioning. Psychic determinism can link into Freud's psychosexual stages. So for example, if we go back to the example that I talked about when looking at gender and cultural bias, Freud said that our experience of the phallic stage of development basically helps us determine our gender. That's to say, it's how we get our gender through associating with the same sex role model, whether that's a male or a female. Now the next thing is free will, and whether or not that matters, because so much of this debate is orientated around determinism, types of determinism, this spectrum of determinism. So why does it matter whether or not we have free will, in terms of what's the consequences of me saying yes, our behaviour is wholly determined? The biggest consequence in terms of what it matters, and students often make some really nice discussion of this in their AO3, is basically in a legal sense. Our legal system is based around the concept of responsibility and knowing that you have committed a crime. It's something that's called mens rea in law. So it matters, for example, if I say that there is a gene for criminality, because if there's a gene for criminality, then it takes the responsibility for committing a crime away from the individual. If the individual cannot be held responsible for that crime, that's to say they're not culpable for the crime, then how can I punish them for that crime? The last bit on the free will and determinism debate is the scientific emphasis on causal explanations. And that basically means determinism. Remember that determinism, the idea is that X equals Y. When I manipulate X in dependent variable, I get this change in a dependent variable. Okay, so the nature-nurture debate. This is a nice one. I say it's a nice one because students often think that they get it because they've heard these terms before, but they perhaps just don't get the complexity of the debate. So this is a debate that runs through the entirety of psychology, and it's a nice debate because basically the finishing point is pretty much always in the middle, which is why we've got interactionism there. So we've got nature at one end, nurture at the other end, and interactionism in the middle. So nature is the idea that our behaviour, our characteristics are determined by our biology, whereas nurture is the environmental influences on our behaviour or characteristics. Whereas interactionism in the middle says that actually they both affect our behaviour. So a really nice way to think about this is in terms of mental illness and talking about the diathesis stress model. So the diathesis stress model states that you may inherit a gene that will give you a predisposition to a particular mental illness, but it's going to take the right environment and a stressful situation in that environment in order for that gene to be triggered. Now, within the nature-nurture debate, there's also this idea of the heritability coefficient, which links into the relative importance of heredity and environment in determining our behaviour. The heritability coefficient is just a value that's assigned to how much of a particular behaviour or characteristic is due to our biology. Now, within attachment to use, within examples to use, I've picked out a couple here, attachment and phobias. The reason I've picked out these is within attachment there is a nature-nurture debate, and within phobias there is a nature-nurture debate. So the attachment nature-nurture debate is basically the debate between Bowlby and the idea that an attachment is an innate, evolutionary, adaptive process, versus the learning theory of attachment, the idea that attachment is something that we learn through a process of association, basically with food and a primary caregiver. We have a similar debate in the sense that there's nature-nurture within phobias. So if we go back to, I just spoke about the idea of the two-process model in terms of the acquisition and maintenance of phobias. So the two-process model is a nurture explanation for how we develop phobias, but you often in your evaluation of that point to the idea that actually some phobias aren't learned. Some phobias are there because they're adaptive for us to happen. That's to say there's a nature element to them. So for example, it's very common to have a fear of heights and a fear or phobia of horrible little insects that look dangerous to us. And the reason we have these phobias aren't because we've learned them, we've actually inherited them, because in inheriting these phobias they give us an evolutionary advantage. It is in our interests to avoid things that are dangerous to us. And a final thing I'm just going to make, I don't want to kind of confuse you too much, but just a misconception among students. When we're discussing the nature-nurture debate, both of these ideas are deterministic. On one hand, we've got the nature side of the debate, saying our behaviour is determined by our biology. And on the other side, we've got the nurture side of the debate, which says our behaviour is determined by our environment. Okay, so the holism and reductionism in debate. We've got holism and reductionism, levels of explanation in psychology, biological reductionism, and environmental stimulus response reductionism. So let's just start in terms of what this debate is about. It's about basically how we choose to study individuals. So if I take, for example, it's not an individual, let's take, for example, my car. If I want to learn about my car, am I best to look at my car in terms of how it functions as a whole, or am I going to get enough detail from just focusing on, let's say, the carburettor within my car? So it's basically the idea the whole is greater than the sum of the parts are the reductionism, and looking at the whole is the holism. Now, one of the terms students often get confused is this levels of explanation in psychology. Levels of explanation just relates to how I'm going to view a particular behaviour or characteristic with an individual. And there's 3 different levels of explanation. The lower, which is the biological, the middle, which is the psychological, and then higher, which is the cultural and social. So let's take the example of depression in individuals. So I can look at that in terms of different levels of explanation, in terms of how reductionist I'm going to be. At the lowest level, I could focus just on the biology of depression, and I could view depression for the idea that it's to do with low levels of serotonin in an individual. But is that really going to tell me about depression in the individual? Because I might want to move up to the middle layer, and I might want to think about, well, there is this psychological explanation of depression as well that says actually depression is as a result of the thought processes and schemas that people have. I might even want to move higher up than that and be a little bit less reductionist and look at the cultural and social aspects of depression and think, wow, across different cultures depression varies, across different genders depression varies, across different time periods depression varies as well. So that's what we mean by levels of explanation, is in terms of, well, what level of reductionism are we going to break it down to? How much holism are we going to allow into it? Now, in terms of what examples to use for biological reductionism and environmental reductionism, psychopathology, and psychopathology is great for issues and debates. It's a really good link in. When you talk about OCD, you look at the genetic explanation of OCD, which asserts that it's the COMT and SERT gene in terms of malfunctioning of those genes which ultimately results in OCD. So what I'm saying is, if I want to understand obsessive compulsive disorder, I can reduce it down to this biological level in terms of understanding it in terms of these genes. For phobias, in terms of looking at the environmental stimulus response reductionism, of course, is the 2-process model, which asserts that I can understand a phobia simply reducing it down to a particular event which born that phobia. So how did that phobia start? It started because there was an association made between an event, the particular event that happened, and a particular thing that was around at that time that created that phobia. And then that phobia was maintained simply by the avoidance behaviour. Now, in terms of what holism is, well, holism is the understanding that I can't view an individual, or at least understand an individual's behaviour, simply by looking at the tiny parts. I've got to take a much more holistic view. I've got to look at the individual as a whole. And if you think about it in terms of cross-referencing issues and debates, this sounds a little bit more ideographic, doesn't it, in a sense? And a great off-spec example that you could use if you wanted to was Isaac's theory of personality. Many of you who wanted to stay on spec have probably drawn in humanistic ideas about looking at the person as a whole to illustrate the holism debate in psychology. Okay, so the ideographic and nomothetic debate. So what is this debate about? Well, it's basically concerned about how we go about conducting research in psychology, whether we choose to use an ideographic method or a nomothetic method, and then what the consequences of using those methods might be. So if we take an ideographic approach, what we're saying is we're concerned with the study of an individual and an individual's experience. So in an ideographic approach, I'm going to use research methods that allow me to explore that individual experience. So ideographic methods will tend to favour research methods that produce qualitative data because I want that richness in detail. So think about things like unstructured interviews. Case studies will produce a lot of detailed qualitative data, unstructured observations. Now, the consequences of an ideographic approach are I'm going to get a lot of detail about a particular individual. What I'm not going to get, though, is a general law and principle. So I can't, for example, for a case study on one individual person, establish general laws and principles because I've only studied a single individual in detail. The nomothetic approach, if you think of it, is the reverse of this. So it's the idea that I don't want to study an individual or a small group of people. I want to study large groups of people. But in order to do this, what I'm not going to be able to do is get the detail that I had if I use the ideographic approach. So I'm going to favour methods that produce quantitative data. So I'm much more likely to use like an experimental method in order to carry out my research. Now, the consequences of this is because I've studied because I've studied a large group of people, I can establish a general law and principle. But what I can't do is tell you too much about an individual and an individual's experience. So, for example, with nomothetic approaches, we often evaluate them saying, well, X didn't act like everybody else did. And this shows us that there's lots of individual differences in behaviour. Okay. Ethical implications is our last one. Now, ethical implications is a bit of a misunderstood area with issues and debates, and we know this because in the 2018 exam, when there was a question on ethical implications, students didn't do very well on this. So why is ethical implications an issue in psychological research? Well, it's because in psychological research we use people. And when we use people, we have to think about how the research is going to impact that person. Now, that's ethics, but we also have to think about how the research is going to influence groups of people and also society as a whole. So that's what we mean by an ethical implication. It's not just thinking about how the research will affect the individual. That's the ethics that we have, but it's also thinking about how it's going to have an impact potentially on wider society. Now, students often get confused with this term social sensitivity. All social sensitivity is a particular area of research that is more likely to have ethical implications because it's socially sensitive. That's to say it's an area that's a little bit taboo. Now, in terms of examples that you can use for ethical implications, you need to be really careful. What you don't want to do is talk about, for example, all of the ethical issues that came out of Milgram's piece of research. That's not an ethical implication, that's an ethical issue. Now, there's a number of really nice examples. You can go off spec, if you like, and talk about the idea of IQ testing. IQ testing was different tests that were developed in order to get into the American Army. And they resulted in many ethical implications because they ended up labelling certain ethnic groups of people as basically being morons. There's also ethical implications like I spoke about earlier in Bowlby's piece of research. The ethical implications of this were that there was a lot of pressure placed on women to stay at home with their children during this critical period. Now, this led to, in terms of society, the idea that women were the ones that had to stay at home, the idea of maternity pay being geared round towards the women, and it's only now that we've really seen this idea started to change and males are allowed to take what's the traditional maternity leave in terms of the longer paid leave absence instead of the mother. But the key thing about Bowlby is there's a pressure then placed on the mother, the idea that she has to stay at home. God forbid she wants to go out and have a career. That's in some sense going to make her a bad mother. All right, I hope this video was useful to you. If you've got any questions about ethical issues and debates in general, just place them into the comment section.